10. Arrival. In the peaceful library, surrounded by volumes of distilled hate and prejudice, the Doctor was thinking hard. They had shown him Ace in a dungeon. A dungeon meant a castle. The castle had to be Himmler's castle, Drakensberg. And Drakensberg was hundreds of miles from Berlin, but Ace was already there, and so was Kriegsleiter. Ace was in danger, but she wasn't dead yet. If that was all they wanted, they could simply have left her body for him to find. If they were using her in some black magic ceremony, the traditional hour was midnight. If they were carrying out some Teutonic folk ritual, it could even be dawn. There was still time. The Doctor rose and began moving around the library, palms flat against the oak-panelled walls. It was a long and painstaking business, but he found what he was looking for at last, a faint hum of energy. He stood looking at the section of wall. There was a knot-hole at eye level. He pressed the knot-hole, and a section of the wall slid back, revealing a simple illuminated booth. It was as easy as that. Much too easy. It was, of course, a trap. The Doctor studied the booth, and its simple control panel. It was a transmat, the crudest, most basic design, a simple link between one place and another. Berlin and Drakensberg. Or, if they'd gimmicked it especially for him, Berlin and a very messy death. Once he got into the transmat and pressed the send button, he'd be utterly helpless. They could disassemble the molecules of his body here and reassemble them anywhere they chose. Anywhere or nowhere. The risk had to be taken, but it could be modified a little. There was a telephone on the corner table, and the Doctor picked it up. It was a long and difficult conversation, which called upon all his considerable powers of persuasion. Finally, the Doctor said calmly, "The decision is yours, Herr Reichsmarschall," and slammed down the phone. He started fishing through all the junk in his pockets. What had he done with his sonic screwdriver? Eventually, the Doctor came up with a Gallifreyan army knife of the kind issued to the Capital Guard. It was engraved, "Property of Castellan Spandrel." Must have picked it up without realising, thought the Doctor. Kneeling by the control panel, he set to work. "The transmat network is activating," called the Warlord. "Ah," said Kriegsleiter. "Then let us go and welcome the Doctor." Hobbling painfully on his stick, he led the way to the other side of the hall, where there stood a simple illuminated booth. At the present moment, it was ringed by SS guards with machine pistols. The Warlord studied a nearby control panel. Any moment now. The guards cocked their pistols. The transmat booth lit up. Then it blew up. Everyone dodged back as fragments of booth rained down. "It's a malfunction," shouted the Warlord. "He must have been killed." "It's a trick," screamed Kriegsleiter. "He's tampered with the booth. He's here somewhere. Search the tower from roof to cellars. Search the whole castle. The Doctor's here, and I want him alive." A squad of guards thundered up the final stretch of stairs, threw open a hatchway, and emerged onto the flat roof of the tower. It was empty. The anti-aircraft gun and its shell rack was in place behind a parapet. The SS banner hung limply against a flagpole in the still air of a windless summer afternoon. They looked over the crenellated parapet to the courtyard below, to the castle gate and the causeway across the moat. Men marched and drilled, and there were guards everywhere. But there was no sign of any intruder. They climbed through the hatchway and clattered down the stairs to search elsewhere. There was a moment of silence. Then the Doctor unwrapped himself from within the SS banner and slid down the flagpole. It had been a lucky landing, all things considered. He'd reprogrammed the transmat beam to reassemble him a foot above the nearest solid surface in an upward direction, and then to self-destruct. He had overshot by a number of feet, and the flagpole had saved him from a nasty fall. The Doctor looked round the parapet, inspecting the anti-aircraft gun and getting a good idea of the layout of the castle and the surrounding countryside. His plan was simple: to find and free Ace. When he had learned as much as he could on the roof, The doctor climbed through the hatch and started moving cautiously down the huge spiral staircase that wound round the interior of the tower. The tower was divided into a number of floors. The top one held dormitories and storerooms. The one below, rather more superior living quarters. Below that was the Great Hall, one giant high-ceilinged circular chamber which took up the whole of the bottom half of the tower. The doctor crouched at the top of the staircase, studying the busy scene below him. Weapons area, drill and training areas, mind control section, central command area. An impressive setup, and one that was oddly familiar. The doctor saw a slight, upright figure in a high-collared black uniform moving about the control centre. All at once, a whole stream of vivid memories came flooding back to him. He saw the mud and barbed wire of a World War I battleground, with weary figures in battle dress charging machine guns through a sea of mud. He saw a Roman chariot hurtling incongruously out of the mists, soldiers in the blue and grey of America's Civil War, and a Mexican guerrilla brandishing his revolver. He saw his old companions, Jamie the fighting Highlander, little Zoe with her computer brain. He saw cycles of meaningless slaughter, endlessly repeated, men wrenched from their own times to replay mankind's unending wars on an alien planet far away, all part of a complex scheme of galactic conquest. And at the centre of it all, moving about their control rooms, emotionless, calculating black-clad figures like the one below, the warlords. And behind them, aiding them, manipulating them, giving them the time technology they needed, the Time Lord renegade who called himself the War Chief. Or, in German, der Kriegsleiter. "Well, he couldn't have spelled it out for me much more plainly," muttered the doctor. "It's just not fair. I settled that lot ages ago, and I thought he was dead." The doctor had paid a high price for that long-ago victory. So vast had been the temporal interference, so many the soldiers displaced from their own time, that the doctor had been forced to ask his own people, the Time Lords, for their help. That help had been given at a price. Once they had him in their hands, the Time Lords had put him on trial for a wide variety of real and imagined crimes. The doctor had always felt that his real crime was making them look foolish. In any event, the trial had followed its stately course. There was never any nonsense about justice in a Time Lord trial, thought the doctor. It was more like a ceremony, a piece of theatre, proceeding on its way to a predetermined conclusion. All in all, though, they hadn't been too hard on him. His companions, Jamie and Zoe, had been returned to their own lives and their own times. The doctor himself had been sentenced to a premature regeneration and a period of exile on Earth. But before that they had punished the warlord. For him there had been no mercy. He had been sentenced to temporal dissolution, a negation of his whole existence, the ultimate punishment. Yet here he was, or someone very like him. And surely the renegade Time Lord, the War Chief as he was calling himself, had been killed by the warlords themselves in some internal dispute. The doctor's reminiscences were interrupted by an amplified voice echoing around the great stone chamber. Down below, the ranks of blonde, strangely identical SS men stood motionless to listen. "Doctor," called the voice, "this is the War Chief. If you are here, Doctor, and I'm sure you are, make your way to the main chamber of the North Tower. But hurry, Doctor. Your young companion is here, and she will soon be in some distress. Make haste if you want to arrive while she is still alive." The doctor saw a bustle of activity in the centre of the room. Then he saw Ace. She had been strapped to a wooden trestle table, and the table upended against a stone pillar. Kriegsleiter stood before the pillar, his silver-topped cane in his hands. He twisted the knob and the tip of the cane glowed red. He slashed it towards the table in a diagonal motion, and the top left-hand corner of the table fell away. Kriegsleiter sliced off the right-hand corner. He paused, speaking into some kind of amplifier. "You see the principle, Doctor? My laser cane is a precision instrument, but the risk to your friend is constantly increasing. If I miscalculate, she may lose an ear or a finger. even a hand or a foot. Don't worry, she won't die. The wounds will cauterize themselves, and I'll be sure to leave enough of her in one piece for our purposes." He swung the laser cane in a high arc, slicing a chunk off the top of the table and a tuft from Ace's hair in the process. "Doctor!" yelled Ace. "If you're there, don't come out. He's just bluffing." Kriegslater swung the cane in a low sweep, cutting a slice off the bottom of the table and removing the toe of Ace's shoe in the process. The doctor stood up, cupping his hands. "All right," he shouted. "Show's over. I'm here." Every face in the hall turned towards him. The doctor strode down the staircase and across the hall. The knife was already in his hands, and he used it to cut the straps that bound Ace to the mangled table. "Quite an entrance, Professor," she said. "Don't worry, they can't scare me." She fainted into his arms. Hermann Goering sat at his desk in the chancellery. His huge fists clenched and unclenched on the desktop before him, and he was glaring into space. One of the shrewdest political brains in Nazi Germany was calculating the odds. To act would be risky, but to do nothing might be riskier still. When people were plotting against you, there was a lot to be said for striking first and striking hard. The Führer himself had proved that back in 1934. He had wiped out the entire leadership of his own private army, the Brown Shirts, on the night of the Long Knives. 2,000 executions in one day. Goering shuddered, remembering little Heine calmly checking the deaths list, ordering up another 4 brown shirts for the firing squad as the bodies of the last 4 were dragged away. They had gone on killing till they were sick of slaughter. Even the firing squad had broken down in the end. Yet, in a way, the memory cheered and encouraged him. The Führer could hardly object when all Goering would be doing would be to follow his leader's own example. Besides, and this motive moved him more than any other, it would be a hell of a lot of fun. He slammed his right fist down on the desk, sending a swastika-decorated desk set jumping inches into the air. "I'll do it! And God help the Herr Doctor if he's wrong. I'll shoot the little devil myself!" Snatching up a telephone, Goering bellowed, "Get me the Bendlerstrasse." "Immediately, Herr Reichsmarschall." As he put through the call, the operator wondered why old Iron Fatty was in such a rush to talk to regular Army HQ. It was some time later, and the Doctor and Ace were confined in the luxurious quarters where Ace had awakened for the second time. This time the door was locked, and there was an SS guard outside it as well. They'd taken the Doctor's Gallifrey and army knife away, but otherwise they were being treated surprisingly well. A simple meal of bread, cold meats, cheese and wine, and fruit had been provided. Ace herself was still disgusted at her own behaviour. "Honest, Professor? Me? Screaming and fainting?" "You've got to stop clinging on to this macho image," said the Doctor, selecting a grape. "In your place, I'd have been screaming the place down ages ago." "My place isn't too good at the moment," said Ace. She had already told the Doctor of her projected role as sacrificial victim. "I hope you've got something up your sleeves." "Several somethings." He lowered his voice. "Remember, Ace, whatever you do, react naturally." The guard opened the door and Kriegslater hobbled in. "Come for a good gloat?" asked the Doctor amiably. "It's the usual procedure in these situations." Kriegslater studied the Doctor from the doorway. "You've changed, Doctor, but not very much. You were an insignificant little man when we met, and you still are." "Well, I tried tall and dignified and all teeth and curls, but it didn't really suit me." He studied Kriegslater curiously. "I may not have changed much, but you have," he said rather tactlessly. "At least, if you really are who you say you are. Used to be tall, dark and handsome, didn't you? I heard you'd been killed. Though come to think of it, they never found your body." "I was shot, Doctor, but not killed. Shot several times at close range with warlord energy weapons. Would you care to know how I survived?" "I have a feeling you're going to tell me." "The warlord's troopers were about to dispose of my body when they realized I was still alive. Just barely, but alive. You know how amazingly tough we Time Lords are, Doctor." Ace stared at him. "You're a Time Lord? Like the Professor?" "Not at all like me, I hope," said the Doctor. "We come in all sorts, just like licorice." He turned back to Kriegsleiter. "I'm sorry, do go on." "They called one of their scientists, and he was so amazed he ordered me sent back to their home planet. They were starting to retreat by then. I was on the last ship to leave." "Why did they bother with you?" asked the Doctor curiously. "From what I remember of the warlords, they'd be far more likely to finish you off." "Oh, there was no thought of curing me, I assure you, Doctor. They just wanted to see how long it would take me to die. They threw me in the ship's hold, and on the journey back to their planet, I started to regenerate." The Doctor nodded. Injury-triggered regenerations were not unknown. His own third regeneration had been caused by a massive dose of radiation. Kriegsleiter went grimly on with his story. It was clear to them both that he had to tell it. "Because of my massive injuries, the extensive tissue damage, the complete lack of all medical care, the regeneration aborted." "No," whispered the Doctor, and Ace saw the pain on his face. Kriegsleiter said remorselessly, "Would you like to see what an aborted regeneration looks like, Doctor?" He threw back his cloak for a second, and Ace got a brief glimpse of a malformed, bandage-swathed torso, sprouting twisted limbs, stubby, extra limbs. It was as if two bodies had been clumsily joined together. She turned her face away in horror. "I will leave you to imagine the state of the skull," said Kriegsleiter, wagging his huge, oddly shaped head. "As you see, I conceal it as best I can." "Regeneration therapy on Gallifrey is very advanced," said the Doctor. "They could help you." "At this stage, Doctor, I doubt it." Kriegsleiter laughed. "Besides, what if they could? They would cure me, and then sentence me to death, or rather to temporal dissolution, unbeing, which is worse than death." "Which reminds me," said the Doctor suddenly, "that fellow I caught a glimpse of out there, high-collared black uniform and a built-in sneer." "He was the caretaker at the Arian Bureau," said Ace. "But down here he said he was a warlord." "Now, he really was sentenced to temporal dissolution," said the Doctor. "What's more, I saw the sentence carried out." "Upon his father, Doctor," said Kriegsleiter. "This is the son, his successor. There is a strong family resemblance. Like me, he has no reason to love the Time Lords." "Tell me something," said the Doctor suddenly. "Why did you leave the Time Lords to join with the warlords in the first place? What had you done?" Kriegsleiter laughed bitterly. "That is the final irony, Doctor. I had done nothing at all, except rise so rapidly in the Time Lord hierarchy that Cardinal Barusa saw me as a rival." So he had a quiet word with his friends in the Celestial Intervention Agency. Evidence of treason was manufactured and planted and found. I fled just in time. The Doctor nodded. The story was all too believable. It had led a once promising young Time Lord into a disastrous alliance with the alien warlords. Ultimately, it had created the monster he saw before him. "I'm afraid Barusa became quite ruthless in pursuit of his ambitions," he said sadly. "It was his downfall in the end, if that's any consolation." "What happened?" asked Kriegsleiter. "Did he ever become president?" "For a time. Then he tried for immortality as well, and got forced into permanent retirement. He's pretty inactive now, and likely to stay that way for some time." The Doctor rose and stretched. "Well, it's all very nice sitting here chatting about the good old days, but it doesn't explain what you're doing here and now." "Gaining my revenge on you, Doctor." "I don't follow." "I survived on the Warlord planet as a medical curiosity. I managed to convince them in time that I was not and never had been a traitor. I came to the attention of the new Warlord. I told him how his father had been destroyed, and convinced him that there was only one way to wipe out the shame of the defeat that you had inflicted on us." "And that was?" "The best, The only revenge for him, as for me, was to come up with a plan for galactic conquest that would succeed. You could hardly be sure I'd turn up again to see it in action. Ah, but I spent years studying your record, Doctor, and it seemed very likely that massive interference with history would bring you out of the spatio-temporal woodwork. So, we found a way to penetrate the barrier the Time Lords had placed about our planet, then we made our plan. Now I suppose we're going to hear all about that too, said Ace. She was getting tired of being a silent audience. Kriegsleiter turned away. I intended to show you something of our operation here, but as you please. You have long hours before you and little to do with them. But if you prefer to stare at the walls until it is time to die... No, said the Doctor hurriedly, taking Ace's arm and heaving her to her feet. Come on, Ace, let's not be ungracious. There's nothing to read and the telly's hardly been invented yet. We may as well take the tour. The Doctor had motives of his own. For one thing, he was genuinely interested. Knowledge was always useful, and prospects of escape had to be better outside their luxury cell. Kriegsleiter rapped on the door and the guard unlocked it. As she followed the others from the cell, Ace was thinking of Kriegsleiter's words. They were going to be shown all the enemy's secrets, told all his plans. Quite obviously, Kriegsleiter wasn't concerned about what they saw or how much they learned about his plans. It simply didn't matter. Before long, they'd be dead.